One of the interesting things about the Switch generation, the thing that has been kind of low key for the most part, is that we finally reached the point where the general Nintendo audience is perfectly willing to acknowledge that new Nintendo games are better than the old ones. This has been like most apparent with like the Zelda IP, but it's also true for a wide range of other franchises, even when people are in denial about it, right? Fire Emblem, Metroid, you know, there are like a lot of examples of like these lower tier like Nintendo franchises that have just exceeded all expectations and far surpassed the original releases. Yeah, there are occasional letdowns like Pikmin 4 that don't live up to the original releases, but for the most part, a lot of these established Nintendo IPs are constantly improving upon themselves. Super Mario Bros. Wonder, as I've said several times already, is far better than Mario 3. The narrative has always been that Super Mario Bros. 3 is so great that it can't possibly be topped and it's one of the best games ever made. And that is not true, right? Like, I've been very adamant about this. Like, going back and playing Mario 3 as much as I have over the past year, like, I've come to realize that that game is nowhere near the level of quality that people make it out to be. Yes, it's a good game. People love it, right? It's like it's an iconic release, but the reason people love it so much is that it was a technologically demanding marvel at the time, right? Like people love Mario 3 because of its nostalgia, not because it's a particularly well-made 2D platformer. In a lot of ways, Mario World surpassed it, Yoshi's Island surpassed it, Mario Wonder surpassed it, right? Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, the original Donkey Kong Country games, right? There are so many like examples of titles that built off of and improved off of the Mario 3 formula. Not that Mario 3 isn't great, but this idea that people have had that like, ooh, the 2D platformer peaked with Mario 3 is completely and utterly false, right? Mario Land has value. Like Mario Land 2 has value. New Super Mario Bros. Has value, right? The idea that these games are worthless because, well, Mario 3 is better is completely and utterly disingenuous, right? How dare people play other 2D platformers other than Mario 3? But when you look back at the history of Nintendo, when you look at like what happened with Sonic the Hedgehog versus Super Mario World, right? The narrative always had to be that like, well, Mario World isn't as good as Mario 3. It was just a method of downplaying the new thing by comparing it to like the extremely popular, successful original release. So people who don't know anything about these brands, who don't know anything about these games, just blindly go along with it because, like, well, the game journal told me this. Well, no, actually. Like, Sonic the Hedgehog is a really good example as to everything that's wrong with the wider gaming community, right? Because Sonic the Hedgehog is nowhere near the level of quality as a Nintendo release. It never has been. But the character sold itself based on having like an extremely appealing design, a marketing campaign, and just this image it had of just being like the cooler Mario. And all of that was fake. All of that was astroturf right from the get-go, right? Uh, Sonic was never, ever, ever going to replace Mario as a gaming icon. But a lot of people, a lot of non-gamers, or people who became interested in games because of the Sega Genesis, right? They got on board with Sonic the Hedgehog and worshipped him as an icon to the point where like he's somewhat recognizable even today. Long after his star has passed. Like people were really interested. People really thought that Sonic could eclipse Mario, or even that he was bigger than Mario in the 90s. It wasn't true. Like Nintendo was already expanding past Sonic with like spin-off games like Donkey Kong Country, like the Wario Land games, like with Yoshi's Island, and Sonic never really did the same thing, right? Who do you know who like has really asked like, oh, I really want a game about Tails, like doesn't happen. But You can see just how Mario became a much stronger brand than Sonic much more quickly, right? 15 years after Super Mario Bros., we got like what? Like Super Smash Bros. Melee, where all the Nintendo characters like established their crossover material. Even when Melee came out, people were begging for Sonic the Hedgehog to be in it, right? Because people knew, like even then, even at that point, that 10 years after Sonic the Hedgehog's inception, Sonic's core identity was being the anti Mario. He doesn't have anything going for him other than that. So what does this mean exactly, right? People like Nintendo games based on their own merits, right? People actually like these titles. While like the opposition, the enemy, all they can talk about is how much they're better than Nintendo. Like every time we see this happen, right? Every time we see one of these like, no name like video game franchises get some kind of momentum, we always see this pattern where like, oh, it's way better than Zelda, whether it's like Dark Cloud or Okami or Skyrim or Dark Souls or Elden Ring, The Witcher 3, like every single time, like, oh, it's way better than Zelda from people who don't know anything about the IP. Like the way these people talk is that they really seem to think that the Nintendo IPs have like fallen off a long time ago, that they're not relevant anymore, that people don't like them, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And what's more, the commonly held assertion from these people over the past several years, the idea that Nintendo peaked in the 90s is being completely and utterly debunked all the time. People are not leaning towards A Link to the Past over Breath of the Wild, right? People do not believe Super Metroid is better than Dread. People do not like necessarily believe the old Nintendo games are inherently better than the new ones. I grew up with Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. I'm super familiar with that game. I know everything about it. Playing Brothership for the first time. The new one, 6, right? Mario and Luigi 6. I'm playing Mario and Luigi 6, and I realize that, like, Brothership is absolutely the best game in the series. And that's just one example, right? There are lots of other examples I can name, games I could name that had a similar kind of trajectory. Nintendo Switch Sports is one. It's way better than like any previous Wii Sports game. You have Metroid Dread, which is better than like Super and the entire history of 2D Metroid, right? You have like titles like that. You have titles that are just growing in relevancy and are just establishing new like standards for the franchises. And when you have that, when you have like Nintendo clearly improving their brands and clearly evolving and clearly doing new things, like the entire core concept of the anti-Nintendo agenda falls apart. Because yes, the Nintendo games are getting better, right? They are not rehashes of things we got in the 90s. And that's especially true for like 2D platformers and things like that, right? They are not just the same games over and over again, like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto, right? Nintendo has more creativity than that. And we're starting to see a slow shift in which the general public is beginning to accept that. The only people you see complaining about Nintendo these days are super religious, just obsessed, like anti-Nintendo shills, right? The people who genuinely believe that Nintendo peaked with like the NES or whatever, right? Those kind of hardcore boomers who just obsessively hate everything Nintendo does and don't even really play the games and yet have these like really really hardcore just opinions about them and the IPs like Zelda stopped being good after Zelda 2. Like I know people who say that, right? You're like, oh man, Miyamoto is a fraud. Like, ooh, like, it's just so silly seeing these people like continue their narratives like they have been for the past 20 years, as if things have not changed, right? And I do think the Switch era is kind of the moment in which the thing that was apparent to me ever since like even the GameCube era, like the early GameCube era, the idea that Nintendo makes better games than the competition, that is becoming increasingly mainstream, right? Because Nintendo is the only entertainment company in the world that seems to not be all that much affected by wokeness, right? Compare like, Tears of the Kingdom versus Dragon Age Veilguard, and you can see just a huge gap in quality. In part because of like the game design philosophy and like the creativity of the developers, but also just a pure understanding of like what people find appealing in video games that can't be censored out by localization or change. Nintendo is just dominating the video game space right now. And there's just nothing that the gaming establishment can do to convince people otherwise.